Russia's military is currently ranked second in the world next to the United States of America. The total available manpower for Russia's military is 70 million. And there are a total of 766,055 active frontline personnel. On top of that, they have 2,485,000 active reserve personnel. A military reserve force is pretty much a military organization that comprises of people from a country who combine their military role with their personal careers. And their main role is pretty much to be available if any time the army has to mobilize and they have to go out and fight. In terms of the land systems, we got to take a look at the tanks, the armored vehicles, and things like the rocket launcher systems. Russia's military has a total of 15,398 tanks, armored fighting vehicles total 31,298, and multiple launch rocket systems total 3,793. So now we take it from the land up to the sky. Total aircrafts for Russia is 3,547. 1,124 of those are transport aircrafts, and a growing fleet of attack helicopters and fixed-wing attack aircrafts. Now, we could talk about the frontline personnel, we can talk about the aircrafts and all the land military systems that Russia has. But of course, everything comes with a price, and the financials actually play just as important of a role in military combat as does an aircraft. Russia's total defense budget is 46,600 million. Now, more recently than not, the Russian Federal Treasury did confirm that Russia's defense budget was cut by 25.5% for the year 2017. This reduction is Russia's biggest cut to their military budget since the early 1990s. This reduction follows a long period of time of large increases to Russia's defense spending, which grew by an average of 19.8% since the year 2011. But despite this cut, the 2017 budget remains about 14.4% higher. The Russian government had initially set out plans to reduce the defense expenditure in the draft of the three-year budget for 2017 to 2019, and that was released on October 26, so we knew there was some sort of cut coming. But Russia has learned over the years how to mobilize their army a lot more efficiently, as well as focus on the most important aspects of their military. Lessons learned from experiences in Ukraine and Syria are also being integrated into Russia's military as it develops more and more. However, the Russian armed forces are still largely in an experimental phase. The modernization of Russia's military has yet to reach certain crucial parts of their military, but in some important areas like nuclear weapons, air defense, and long-range guided missiles, Russia has invested a lot of capital in those areas, and yeah, we see the results. There was a military reform that was launched by Defense Minister Anatoly Serdyukov, and that began just a couple of months after the triumph in August of 2008, where Russia was at war with Georgia. At that time, the Russian command control communications and intelligence did not perform very well at all in that battle. Russian communication systems were outdated, even certain essential equipment like GPS systems and precision-guided weapons couldn't even be used. But Russia's defense minister at the time, Anatoly Serdyukov, was replaced in November of 2012 by Sergei Shoigu, and he helped in correcting a lot of the mistakes in the military reforms and shifted the focus to combat training. And we saw the results of the improved combat training that the Russian military was receiving in 2014 when we saw Russia take control of the Ukraine territory, Crimea. But as I mentioned before, several key elements of Russia's military still have not been touched by an ounce of modernization yet. We already had taken a look at a brief summary of what Russia has in play in terms of their military personnel and equipment that they have, but now we've also seen how Russia has been struggling with getting their military up to par. Despite that, they're still the second most powerful military. So if Russia could be conquered through a military strike, how could this actually happen? One thing to note, Russia does reserve the right to use nuclear weaponry, even in regional conflict scenarios. And clearly, Russia is a massive country in land size. Its territory covers more than 1/8 of the Earth's inhabited land area and stretches across 9 different time zones. Even with 143 million people living in Russia, there simply is way too much land to seize and control all of Russia. However, this could happen if China mobilized half of its population and sent them to cover the wilderness of Siberia. It's also estimated that the United States would need 500,000 troops in Afghanistan to secure the whole country of Russia. But just to give you an idea of how guarded Russia is, it borders 16 other countries. It would also be next to impossible to neutralize any of Russia's nuclear capabilities. This is because Russia possesses what they call second strike capability. Second strike capability is a country's capability to respond to a nuclear attack with a powerful nuclear retaliation of their own. It's estimated that Russia possesses 4,300 nuclear warheads, 700 strategic warheads, and 2,000 non-strategic warheads in storage. Now, I mentioned before that Russia borders 16 other countries, so depending on where the attack is coming from, you got a lot to go through in order to get to Russia. However, despite that, Russia's borders are pretty indefensible. There are no natural obstacles like mountains and huge lakes that would hinder any sort of military advance. Historically, however, every major advance that threatened Russia's existence, from the Poles in 1610 to Hitler in 1941, those attacks came from the northern European plain. So if a country wants to launch a military attack on Russia, that's probably the best place that they can launch the attack from. This is why Joseph Stalin, after World War II, was very keen on seizing Central Europe. And the current president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the country. Russia also has very weak allies like Belarus and Kazakhstan. There's also India and China, but you can hardly call those countries allies to Russia as well. But as it stands, Russia's closest relationship with any major country in the world right now is India. Nevertheless, Russia in and of itself is a very mighty country, a country where people, despite certain global criticism, still push forward to creating a more modern and progressive future.
Now, the common name for special forces within Russia is Spetsnaz, which is an abbreviation for Войска Специального Назначения, basically meaning special military purpose units, roughly in translation. Now, as for history, this is where it gets very interesting and a little tough, because for some forces, they are rather modern. For example, the Special Operations Forces, known as the CCO, which I might also refer to as SOF. This particular unit falls under the Operational Forces Command, known as the KSO, and was recently formed in 2009. But the thing is, the term Special Forces and Spetsnaz and all that sort of stuff has existed long before this group was ever created and has a history from well before the KGB. Because if we look at the KGB was basically kind of like the state security, and they had special forces units within it. However, the KGB was actually formed from 4 other units. You have Cheka, which is basically the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission that was formed from the old Soviet Union police units, and that was created on December 5th, 1917. As well, there was also the NKVD, which was the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. Now, the NKVD was also formed out of policing units, and they oversaw the country's prisons, labor camps, and were also a secret policing force that was formed in 1936. However, this group grew into what is known as the MVD, and I'm going to be using this term much throughout this video, because the MVD is the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which was created in 1946. As well, there was also the NKGB, which was a form of secret police and counterintelligence that was created on February 3rd, 1941. However, eventually, this unit evolved into what is known as the Military State Security, known as the MGB in 1946. However, the MGB was also classified as a secret policing force until about 1953. However, on March 13th of 1953, all these units were thrown in together and created the KGB, and this is where you get the birth of a lot of Spetsnaz. And I also want to mention, considering on this channel I talk a lot about special forces, Russia has a very different model of how the special forces came to be. Unlike most other countries where the special forces have evolved from the airborne troops, Russia's more or less came from these secret policing forces. However, I should also mention that Russia has a special forces group within the airborne, and on top of that, it's like the second largest airborne unit in the entire world. The entire airborne, or the paratroopers of Russia, are huge. And one of the reasons why this might not have evolved compared to other countries is because most of the airborne troopers during the Second World War were used more as foot soldiers, with only a handful ever being dropped anywhere during the Second World War. The Allies, however, used paratroopers for more specialized operations. But jumping back to the KGB, these guys were in charge of internal security, intelligence, and secret policing. For this group was present during quite a few operations internationally, such as the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989, and in one particular operation known as Operation Storm-333, Russian forces, including the Spetsnaz at the time, seized the Tajbeg Palace and took out the Afghan president in 1979. Now, within the KGB at this time, there were two major Spetsnaz groups. There was the famous Alpha group as well as its sister group known as Spetsgruppe V or Spetsgruppe Wimpel. And these two units, believe it or not, are still active today. They survived the fall of the Soviet Union and are now under what is known as the FSB. Because for the KGB, it existed until the fall of the Soviet Union, in which it was replaced by what is known as the FSK, or the Federal Counterintelligence Service. And this group existed from 1991 until April 3rd of 1995, when it was renamed and replaced by what is now known as the FSB. However, let's keep in mind that not all special forces today fall under the FSB. And to identify the different special forces groups, in ground forces they usually wear the blue beret, and in the Navy special forces they wear black, where the National Guard wears maroon. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to break down these individual units and give a little bit of a summary and a little bit of history on them. So let's talk about Spetsgruppe V, or Wimpel. These guys have been around since 1981 and are still active today. Because in 1995, the FSB ended up gaining control over this group, and for their history, most of them came from training centers from what is known as the KUOS Training Center, which was eventually absorbed into the KGB Academy that has a history dating back to 1955. Overall, the size of this unit is really hard to say. They say there's probably around 1,000 of these soldiers that are trained in special forces operations. And the mastermind behind this whole group was Major General Ivanovich Drozdov. Also, when they merged in 1995 with the FSB, they moved heavily towards counter-terror and, of course, became nuclear safety enforcement. Moving right along, let's talk about the Alpha Group. Very similar, but definitely has a different history. Formed on July 28, 1974, they were part of a Spetsnaz group with the KGB right off the bat. And of course, this unit is known as the sister group to the Wimpel units. This group was created by the KGB chairman, Yuri Andropov. And as well, similar to most special forces groups within Europe around that time, they were created in a direct response to the Munich massacre, which happened in 1972. Some people also believe that their creation was in response to the German group, the GSG-9, but let's be realistic, what happened in Munich was a major changing point for many countries around the world. Most of them saw that terror was becoming a big thing, and they said, well, we gotta create units that specialize in counter-terror. And although most are not quite sure about the size of this unit, in 1991 they estimated that there was maybe 500 soldiers. However, the group as of 2004 has shrunk down to approximately 250 to 300. And as for today, it's pretty much still a mystery. Now moving right along, let's talk about another group that most people forget simply because it's not really part of the army, it's part of the National Guard. This group is known as the SOBR, and it was formed on February 10th, 1992. Originally, they operated under the MVD, and since their introduction, they've had a crazy history, as in 2002, they were dissolved and put into the Regional Criminal Police Officers, known as the Special Police Unit, or OMSN. However, in 2007, it was estimated that there was about 5,000 of these soldiers part of this unit, and by April 5th of 2016, with the introduction of the new National Guard, they were thrown under that command. Overall, when it comes to the land forces of the Spetsnaz in Russia, they use a variety of equipment, mostly AKs from the AK-74 to the AK-12 and the AK-105. They also sometimes use HK-416s and M4A1s. For machine guns, they are most commonly seen with the PKM, and as for snipers, they use many different versions of the Dragunov, and of course the Accuracy International AWM. Lastly, let's talk about the naval special forces because it's really fascinating. First of all, the naval infantry for Russia is one of the oldest infantry units that they have, having a history that dates back to its formation on November 16th, 1705. It was formed because of the actions that was happening during the Napoleonic War. But to go into the very specific group, let's talk about the naval Spetsnaz. Now, these are a special forces group and are also known as the Frogmen of Russia, in which they say they have about 800 in their group and have been around since 1941. It's also interesting to know that the very first mention of a frogman in military history for Russia was during a war game at Vladivostok on October 22nd, 1938. Basically, what happened was during the war game, a bunch of scuba divers exited the submarine through a torpedo tube and sabotaged the naval base during the skirmish. I also want to mention that even women have had a major role in the special forces of Russia, but most specifically during the Second World War, although the frogmen performed over 200 missions, it was a single female diver named Dina Kozeva who performed a rescue operation in the Volga River anywhere between 1940 and 1941. As for the frogmen of Russia, they used the APS underwater assault rifles and the SPP-1 underwater pistol, as well as Triton mini submarines and a lot of other equipment. Overall, when it comes to the special forces, they are widely appreciated for their hard work and effort, as on October 24th every single year, Russia has what is known as the Special Forces Day. And as well, when it comes to that new group that was created that I was talking about, known as the SOF, they have their very own Appreciation Day, which happens on February 27th. As well, when it comes to the SOF, as I mentioned, it is a rather new group being introduced into Russia in 2009. This happened when the country decided to reform the entire armed forces, and for them, they say they have approximately 2,000 operatives within this unit, and since then, they've been involved in many different operations around the world.
Now, when I told you that I love Russian girls, let's talk about the girls, because there's one interesting thing about Russia, and that is women outnumber men. As a matter of fact, they say that there are about 9 million more women to men in the entire country. Studies have shown that to 100 women, there is approximately 86.8 men. And the reason for this is partly due to the Second World War. But it's not just war that makes men's population low, it's also alcohol. Alcohol is predominantly a major problem with deaths with young men in the country. And although 52% of Russian women view alcohol as a major problem, a 2005 study showed that 37% of males would die before the age of 55 due to alcohol-related deaths. Now let's get off the bad topics and move on to some of the more positive things about Russia. One thing for sure is that Russia has a great population of 146 million people, with over 3/4 of its population living in cities such as Moscow and the beautiful St. Petersburg and so on. And some people might think that with Russia's size, it is the country with the smallest population density. But actually, if you spread everyone out, they do manage to have 21 people per square mile, compared to Greenland, which is like nothing. 0. Now, when we talk about density, let's be real, Russia is huge. As I stated earlier, it is the largest country in the entire world, with a landmass of over 17,075,200 square kilometers, which makes up almost the landmass of Canada and the United States combined. But with all this land, it has a lot of forest, and because of that, Russia is sometimes called the lungs of Europe. And therefore, the Russian forests are second to the Amazon rainforest when it comes to their trees consuming carbon dioxide. Also interesting thing about the land is it has a lot of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The country has over 26 of them, but one of the most amazing sites is the volcanoes of Kamchatka, which is a collection of 160 volcanoes with 29 of them being extremely active. And as for the ones that are alive, they are considered the largest active volcanoes in the northern hemisphere, and it is really quite an amazing spectacle. The scientists of Russia have done some amazing accomplishments, but one thing that Russian scientists have done that they can claim 100% theirs is they have the oldest plant ever to be regenerated from the seeds from over 32,000 years ago. This is the Selene stentophyllol, and although it was frozen in permafrost for such a long time, scientists managed to bring this plant back to life from its fruit tissues. Now here on FTD Facts, we also like to talk about some of the imports and exports of these countries. And Russia, for example, has over $449 billion in exports, and imports $295 billion in goods, with the biggest export being crude petroleum making 35%, and refined petroleum making 20%. And because of those numbers, they are the second biggest exporter of oil in the entire world. But their biggest imports are cars, making up 5.3%. In Russia, you will also notice that it has beautiful landmarks. We're not talking just about its architecture and buildings, we're also talking about its statues. But one of the most famous is the statue of the worker and the Kolkai woman, done by Vera Mokina. It is a stainless steel statue that is 80 feet high. And although it is now located in Moscow, it was first introduced at the World's Fair in 1937. And the statue alone was a significant visual of the war against Nazism during the Second World War, as the statue was placed opposite of the German Nazi flag to show their rivalry. Now, to talk about accomplishments within this country, we cannot forget about the Russian space program. But what makes the space program groundbreaking is it was the first program to send a man into space and to even orbit the Earth. That cosmonaut was Yuri Gagarin, and he launched from Earth in his Vostok space capsule on April 12, 1961. And because of that crowning achievement, the Russian space program has become one of the most influential space programs in the world, collaborating with scientists all over the globe. Now, with a big country and territory comes a big army. Russia's army comes in 5th over the world with over 1 million people in active service and 2 million people in reserve service as of 2017. And that army costs around $69 billion a year. And when it comes to military, we unfortunately have to talk about its nuclear arsenal. Maybe not one of the most proud things for a country to have, but here on FTD Facts, we talk about the good and the bad. But in 1988, it was reported that Russia at one point had over 45,000 warheads, with over 715 detonations. But however, since then, there's been major steps in decommissioning these deadly warheads and nuclear vessels. But currently, right now, it is estimated that Russia has over 7,000 nuclear warheads. But moving back over to achievements of Russia, the country has many of them. It's a country of great intelligence due to its over 600 universities, and because of its great education, Russia has earned 27 Nobel laureates, spreading across literature, chemistry, physics, and above all, peace.
Я понимаю ее как поклон.
Now with that in mind, let's talk about one very interesting fact about the Museum of St. Petersburg, which is called the Hermitage. This is one of the most famous museums in all of Russia. It's actually one of the oldest and largest museums in the entire world. Being built back in 1754 by Catherine the Great, it didn't actually open to the public until 1852, almost 100 years later. And it is a culmination of how Russians preserve not only their culture of beauty, but culture of knowledge and literature. But one thing that's funny about this museum is it's not just the knowledge and art that's inside, but it's the fact that this museum has currently 74 cats living in the museum to fight off rodents. Sounds like a good idea to take care of pests. And speaking about literature, well, we gotta talk about literature because some of you guys were like, hey man, you gotta talk about the literature of Russia because, well, Russian literature is, well, world renowned. And it's not just impressive and very good, but it's also vast. And just to skim the surface of it all started way back in the Middle Ages around the 10th century. But by the 1830s, it had grown and flourished, and as a matter of fact, that is when they called it the Golden Age of Russian literature. This was Russian Romanticism, and it was amazing. It was brought on by poetic talents like Vasily Zudkovsky, and let's not forget the first Russian novelist, Nikolai Gogol, who's even had his face put on stamps. Now, in our last video, we did talk about the alcohol issue, and some of you guys were like, Dave, you're not absolutely right. For example, Boris DuPont said that there hasn't been a problem with it since 2007. Thanks for giving us that information, and just because that, we're going to actually dive deeper into the alcohol issue. So in Russia, they say that alcohol is a huge problem, but in 2008, suicide claimed over 38,000 lives. Now, their experts do say that alcohol contributed to half of those suicides. However, in 2010, President Dmitry Medvedev doubled doubled the minimum price of alcohol to combat this problem. However, in 2014 and 15, the state proposed to drop that because of the financial crisis. And in 2016, 49 people died in Irkutsk from methanol poisoning. And this had Prime Minister Medvedev calling out for a ban of non-traditional alcoholic liquids. In 2011, the World Health Organization reported that the annual per capita consumption was 15.75 liters, making it the fourth highest European country to drink. But however, they are striving to take care of the problem, and even some areas in Russia are actually really focusing on it. But Russia isn't just great for its people committing to being bigger and better within themselves. It's also impressive for its landscape. It is vast and huge. For example, the Caspian Sea. She's big. Actually, some people consider it to be the biggest lake on the planet, stretching over 371,000 square kilometers. But what's funny about this sea is we are always under the implication that sea level is constant throughout the entire planet. But that is not really true, because the Caspian Sea shores are at negative 28 meters below sea level. Russia, always gotta do something different. Now, of course, Russia has a completely different language. As a matter of fact, it's one of my favorite languages. And Russian is the 5th most spoken language throughout the planet. But one thing that's interesting about the Russians is their alphabet. They don't use our type of alphabet. The Cyrillic alphabet is very different, and it's considered one of the newest alphabets in the world. And although it was first introduced in the 9th century by the Bulgarian Empire at the Peslav Literacy School, the modern version of it didn't come in till about 1708. And even in 1919, the alphabet was threatened to be replaced by the Latin alphabet in order for them to become more westernized, but it looks like they stuck with their tradition. Also, in our last video, we talked about the volcanoes of Kamchatka, one of the most impressive volcano stretches in the entire world. But in Russia alone, they have 12 active volcanoes. And to give you an update on the Kamchatka region, in the last 275 years, it has had 50 major eruptions. So when we talk about Russian culture, let's be real, we can't forget about the Nutcracker. You guys might have seen it, I know I've seen it, and we all know the dance from the Nutcracker. Well, actually, the dance in Tchaikovsky's famous ballet is based off a Ukrainian traditional and aerobic dance. It's called the Tripek, and as a matter of fact, Russia has over 10 different traditional formal dances that are known throughout the world. And considering we're talking about ballet, well, it's a huge thing in Russia, it was a huge thing in Paris, but why did it become so big in Russia? We all know Russians are great dancers, and although ballet originated in France, one of the most important theater groups at the time of the initial height of ballet was the National Opera of Ukraine, which had an opera company in 1867 in Kiev. And although it was a small company, by 1893 they were capable of putting on large-scale ballets. And that theater alone was one of the contributing factors to ballet becoming such a traditional thing. Now, with Russia being so vast and huge, you need transportation to get from one side of Russia to the other. And in the 1800s, one of the fastest ways to get from point A to B was the railway, and I'm talking about the Trans-Siberian Railway. Starting in Moscow, going all the way east to Vladivostok, it is the longest railway in the entire world. And it comes in at a total 9,289 kilometers, being built in 1891 to 1916. And to close out for fun, let's talk about how the Russians are crazy fun people. Just like us Canadians, they like to do crazy things in the winter. For example, they've got the record for having the most amount of people going downhill on skis in bikinis. Oh yeah. And for me, I love it because, woo, I love my snow bunnies, as we call them. Now, this happened at the Sharagesh ski resort, and they said they had anywhere between 700 to 1,000 people. Now, here on FTD Facts, in our previous videos, we haven't talked about the provinces of Russia. And in Russia, they aren't really called provinces, they are called federal subjects. And Russia has a lot of them. They got 85 federal subjects. It's insane. Now, the largest of these subjects is the Sakha-Yakhotia Republic, which has 3,103,000 square kilometers of land. And out of these 85, 3 are considered federal cities, and Moscow has the highest amount of population, coming in at 10,382,754 people. However, if we want to talk more about the Moscow Oblast province, they would have about 6.6 million people. Now, out of all of Russia, within all these people, there are approximately 184 ethnic groups. And in 2010, a census showed that 81% are ethnically Russian. However, they also do have other groups such as Armenians, Chechens, the Chuvash, the Bashkir, Ukrainians, and Tatars, who are the biggest minority, making up 3.9%. Now, if you've ever heard of rhythmic gymnastics, you may know already that it was invented in Russia. It's basically an annual sport that they do. It features, I guess, rhythm and gymnastics. It's really quite cool. But as for the Federation of Rhythmic Gymnastics, it started in 1963. And since then, like I said, pretty much it's an annual competition within Russia. Now, in your own town, you've probably seen construction equipment that in order to get through mud, they have tracks instead of wheels. But did you know that it was actually a Russian that came up with the idea of putting these tracks on a vehicle? Although the idea for continuous tracks came up the years prior, it was a man named Dmitry Zagreyatsky who attached the tracks to a carriage in 1837. And unfortunately, at that time, he didn't have the funds for a prototype, and he lost the patent 2 years later. And considering we're talking about inventions, we should probably mention the fact that firefighting foam was invented in and by a Russian inventor. His name was Alexander Lorin, and he created it in 1902. He was a teacher in Baku, which at the time was a major oil hub for Russia. And because of all the oil accidents he saw, he was like, well, I gotta do something about this. He looked for a way to suppress oil fire and succeeded by patenting the foam in 1904 and even creating a fully functioning extinguisher that same year. Now, one thing that I was really shocked about is that I found out that Russia is a country that has the second highest amount of water out of any country in the entire world. Next to Brazil, Russia has 4,508 cubic kilometers of water. And the reason I found that weird is because I was always told in Canada that we had the most amount of fresh water in the entire planet. But I guess Brazil has it, and then it's Russia, and then it's us. And when I talk water, I'm talking fresh water. And one thing that Russia has that contributes to this freshwater surplus is it is home to the largest freshwater lake in the entire world. And that lake is Lake Baikal, and she is huge. Alone, she contains 22 to 23% of the world's fresh surface water, coming in at 23,615.39 square kilometers. She is so big that if you took Canada's Great Lakes and America's Great Lakes and combined them all together, yeah, it wouldn't even equal the amount of water that's in this lake. And not only does she have the most water, but Lake Baikal is considered the world's oldest lake, being approximately 25 million years old. And although she may look skinny and nothing compared to the Great Lakes, she is currently the world's deepest lake, with an average depth of 744 meters to a max depth of 1,642 meters deep. And because of her importance, she is highly protected for pollution, and because of its importance, Lake Baikal became a World UNESCO zone in 1996. Now, one thing I really do love about Russia is they are pioneers in space exploration. And as a matter of fact, they were the first country to send a space station into the atmosphere. And in total, not including partnerships with the United States or other countries, Russia alone has launched 10 space stations. The first one being Salyut 1 in 1971, and the last one being Mir, which was sent up in 1986, which had the most days in space, coming in at 5,511 days. And following that, Russia allied with other countries like United States and Canada to create the International Space Station in 1998. Now, we've talked a lot about accomplishments of the countries, we talked about the land and all that, but what about its art? Now, we all know Disney and Warner Brothers in America are the cartoon mega hitters, but my question is there like a Disney in Russia? Like, they've got to have one, right? Well, animation has been a big part of Russian culture, with the first animator being theoretically Alexander Shiryaev, creating the first animation around 1906. Now, this was more stop-motion animation where he had doll ballerinas dance around on film. But the thing with Alexander, though, he never really put his films out there, and because of that, his gift to the world was never put into the light until he was rediscovered in 1995. But what about a mega hitter like Disney? Well, by 1935, things changed for Russia. This is because this was the first year of the Moscow Film Festival, and Disney had sent a small short of Mickey Mouse to the country. And because of that moment, Russians became interested in cartoon animation. And if we were to talk about one company that could be considered the Russian equal to Disney, that would go to Soyuz Multfilm, which was the largest animation studio in Russia during the Soviet times. It was based out of Moscow, being created on June 10th, 1936. And they became extremely popular, making shows for children, and adding even a puppet division in 1954. At its height, it had over 700 employees and released 22 films a year, even 43 in like the 1970s, but because of its ties to the government by the time the Soviet Union came to an end, the animation company suffered great losses. But by 1999, the government had refunded the company once again, however splitting it in two, one which secures and protects old films, and the other which is aimed to create new films.
We are looking at the biggest submarine. This particular class is known as the Akula class to the Russians, and the NATO designation is what they call the Typhoon class. For those who don't know, the reason why I have to clear this up is because there is also a NATO designated Russian submarine that is also known as the Akula, in which the Russians have it designated Project 971 or the Shuka B submarine, but the Typhoon is designated Project 941. So this is Project 941 that we're talking about. Phew, got that out of the way. Hope you guys aren't that confused. We're talking about one big sub, not the little tiny one. And to get started into this whole video, why do they call it the Akula class? Well, because that is Russian for shark. And definitely when it comes to this submarine, it was definitely a predator and was better than anything America had at the time. Maybe the Americans had things that were more accurate or more silent subs, but this one had the most amount of nukes. As a matter of fact, the Akula class submarine was so advanced that at the time of its release, the Americans were like, what? The Russians could actually make something like this? When this submarine came around, most of the Americans were like, wow, they were 10 years ahead of where we thought they actually were. And to give you an idea of how this ship all works and why it's so deadly, let's take a little look at its history. So this nuclear-powered ballistic missile began construction in 1976. At the time, Russia had a very good knowledge that the Americans had, or at least were building, the Ohio-class submarine. And the Ohio-class was large. As a matter of fact, it's the competitor to the Akula-class sub. And as a matter of fact, both of these submarines are still, in fact, the largest submarine classes that have ever been built. And to give you an idea of the differences between the two in terms of size, the Ohio class came in at 560 feet long, whereas the Typhoon, or the Akula, was 574 feet long. But of course, it wasn't just the size of the submarine, it was also what it was capable of, and that was firepower. On the American side, you had the Ohio-class submarine that was capable of firing 192 nuclear warheads in one salvo. These also had a firepower of approximately 100 kilotons. Some of you may be out there going, what the heck is a kiloton? How do I measure that? Well, to give you an idea, the Hiroshima bomb, that was 15 kilotons. So these are a lot bigger. They could destroy a city completely. However, of course, the Russians wanted to do bigger and better and longer, and therefore they created the R-39 SLBM, which stands for Submarine Launched Ballistic Missile. Now, before I get into the specifics of this missile, which was made for the Typhoon class submarine, I should probably mention that this submarine came into service in 1981. And as I stated prior, it's still in use today. They just stopped making them in 1989. In total, they had about 7 of these ships planned, with only 6 of them being made. 2 of them are now currently laid up, 1 is still floating, and 3 of them have been retired. As well, interesting enough, when they built these crafts, they were either sponsored by a city or a company to make them. But let's jump back to the R-39 missile, because this was a very important missile that made the Typhoon extraordinarily dangerous. The R-39 missile was introduced in 1983, and it stayed in service until approximately 2004. Now, these missiles had an effective range of 8,300 kilometers. In case you're wondering, if you were to go into the middle of America and the middle of Russia, that's 8,800 kilometers long. So therefore, these ships were capable of firing to American shores while being deep within Russian waters. Now, to give these missiles the extra range, they actually had to be modified, and they were considered one of the heaviest SLBMs in the world, coming in with a total weight of 84 tons. And why were these missiles and the Typhoon class so extraordinarily dangerous? The reason for this is because within one of these missiles, they were armed with 10 nuclear warheads, with each one being approximately 100 to 200 kilotons. And that was just within one warhead, because within the Typhoon or Akula class submarine, they had 20 of these missiles ready to go and fire.
Let's talk about the Russian space program because it's really fascinating and you guys might be surprised at what they've accomplished. Before the Russian space program, known to many in the past as the USSR Soviet Space Program, but today has evolved to become the Russian Federal Space Agency, or RFSA. Now you could say that the two programs are almost separate from each other because the RFSA began on February 25th, 1992, and that's for the Soviet program. It started all the way back in the 30s. But before we can really get into some cool facts about the Soviet space program, we need to understand where it all came from. We need to learn about its origins. Back in the 1800s, because of scientists such as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who inspired the Russian Empire to look into space as an academic, he helped evolve a group of scientists to create a group called the GIRD on September 15th, 1931. Now it stood for the Group for Study of Reactive Motion, and these group of guys created the world's first rocket program, eventually creating the GIRD-9, which was the first liquid-fueled rocket and the first hybrid rocket being the GIRD-X, created on November 25th, 1933. But unfortunately at this time it was still quite a ways before it became a space program. During the Second World War, the Russians had captured scientists and plans for the V-2 rocket program that was created by the Germans, which eventually led to the creation of the world's first and Russia's first intercontinental ballistic missile. And it was called the R-Semyorka, which was built in 1957. Now, unlike NASA, the Soviet space program was heavily fused with the Russian military. And although Sergei Kirillov, who was the father of the Russian atomic bomb, was working under the military, he kept his goals of space exploration secret from them. And the rocket and space program was second in military spending because the military needed ICMs. And even though the idea of space exploration was pretty much laughable at the time, they did indeed release Sputnik 1, which was the first satellite to ever leave the Earth, putting it into a low orbit on October 4th of 1957. Although Sputnik 1 was the first satellite ever, it didn't have any sensory equipment. But however, because they tracked and studied Sputnik, it gave scientists ideas of how the upper atmosphere and orbit works. And although the Soviet space program was behind the United States, who put a monkey into orbit by 1948, they were the first country to put a dog in space, and more importantly, it was the first animal to ever orbit the planet. The dog's name was Laika, and she was a stray dog found on the streets of Moscow, and she was launched into space in Sputnik 2 on November 3rd, 1957. However, unfortunately, Laika died in the spacecraft due to overheating because of equipment failure. And for some, many viewed Sputnik as the future of space exploration, but for some, it screamed fear. The Sputnik program had become good propaganda to fuel the Cold War, which in turn fueled the space race. This era was known as the Sputnik crisis, and America had become quite fearful of Russia's new achievements, and therefore because of Russia, that is why NASA was created. Now if you were to compare NASA to the Russia program, you'd probably say NASA's bigger and better because they landed people on the moon. But before they landed anybody on the moon, Russia had achieved much more. First of all, they were the first program to ever put a man and a woman into space. The first astronaut or cosmonaut to ever go into space was Yuri Gagarin, who flew way past the atmosphere on April 12, 1961 in the Vostok 1 space capsule. He was also put into an orbit at 161 kilometers above sea level and flew around the Earth in orbit for 108 minutes. And what I find really crazy about that is because Yuri was only 27 years old, which most people will credit Sally Ride as the youngest astronaut, but if you want to be technical, Sally was 33, and I mean Yuri, yeah, he was like 27. But to top both of them, Gurman Titov was a 25-year-old cosmonaut when he went up into space in Vostok 2. He was also the second person to orbit the planet and was the fourth person in space because the Americans had sent up 2 people in between Vostok 1 and Vostok 2.
The question that so many people are asking is, why is Russia invading Ukraine in the first place? Well, the history behind this traces back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Russia's path to reclaim a place on the global scale, as well as Ukraine's fight to protect its sovereignty. For a century, the Russian Empire and the Habsburg Empire were in control of all of the territory that makes up present-day Ukraine. And then, many years later, Ukraine became a cornerstone of the Soviet Union, which by the end of the Union consisted of 15 Soviet socialist republics. Now, the factor number 9 has to do with the end of the Soviet Union. Well, when it comes to the formation back in the year 1922, Ukraine and Russia were two of the founding members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR, or commonly just referred to as the Soviet Union. Now, ironically, Russia and Ukraine were also the signatories of the treaty that terminated the Union in December of 1991, and that was when Ukraine voted for independence in a democratic referendum. The end of the Union also ended the ban on the Ukrainian language. So this seemed like it was a step forward for Ukraine, but not necessarily. Either way, let's move on to fact number 8, the formation of NATO. Following World War II, the United States, as well as Western European forces, they formed what is known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short, which is an intergovernmental military alliance that was first created to block the Soviet Union's growing influence. Now, let's look at Article 5. NATO members, they agreed to Article 5 of the treaty. And this article states that an attack on any NATO member is considered an attack on all members. Yeah. So this, of course, was more than enough to deter the Soviet Union from ever invading countries who had joined NATO. Number 6 takes us to the expansion of NATO. Starting in the year 1999, about 8 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO began to expand. And by the year 2004, NATO added the former Soviet Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And then 4 years later, NATO declared that it had the intention to offer membership to Ukraine someday in the distant future. And that, of course, crossed a red line for Russia. And by the year 2020, NATO had added an additional 14 members, and many of those were once Soviet-controlled countries. Russia sees NATO as a big threat. Vladimir Putin, who is the president of Russia, he's voiced his opinion loud and clear many times that he sees that NATO's expansion is an existential threat. And the idea of having Ukraine join NATO, well, that, in his words, is a hostile act. He was even reported saying that Ukraine's aspiration to join the military alliance was a dreadful threat to Russia. This brings us to number 4. Russia sees Ukraine as part of Russia. In the past, Vladimir Putin has emphasized his view that Ukraine is a part of Russia, culturally, linguistically, as well as politically. Now, there are some people, mostly Russian-speaking people in Ukraine's east, they feel the same as the president, but more Ukrainian-speaking population in the West, they have generally been more in favor of individuality and greater integration with the rest of Europe. So on that issue, Ukraine being part of Russia, you're going to get a whole lot of different mixed answers depending on who you ask. That brings us now to number 3, the annexation of Crimea. Relations were further made a lot more complicated between Russia and Ukraine after Russia annexed Crimea. And Crimea is a strategic military and shipping base of the Black Sea, and this happened back in the year 2014. It was a major event. It was all over the news. Either way, in February and March of 2014, Russia invaded and subsequently annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, and this took place in the aftermath of what is known as the Revolution of Dignity. The Crimean Peninsula has been historically tied to Russia, but it had been integrated into Ukraine and was a major economic asset to them after the fall of the Soviet Union. The next fact, NATO reiterates their intentions. And by the way, NATO does not recognize Russia's sovereignty over Crimea. But moving on though, at a 2021 NATO conference, the member nations reiterated that they had intentions to acquire Ukraine. And this triggered the most recent Russian military aggression that has accumulated in this invasion in 2022. Now we end this episode off with number 1, what Russia wants with Ukraine. Well, the biggest reason for the invasion is for Russia to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. NATO's land border with Russia would significantly increase if Ukraine had joined them. Also, Russia established a naval base in Crimea after annexation, and if Ukraine were to join NATO, well, this would give Ukraine significantly more resources to potentially take back the peninsula.